Welcome to Slumbertainment. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let yourself relax. Tonight's story is Pilgrim's Shadow. Please like and subscribe for more restful content. Now, let's begin. The first light of dawn crept across the rooftops of Canterbury, gilding the worn stone of the cathedral in a pale, trembling gold. In the quiet streets, a lone figure moved with measured steps, his robes brushing against the cobbles. Elric Atherton, monk of St. Augustine's Abbey, paused at the edge of the cathedral's cloister, the rising sun casting his tall shadow across the dew-soaked grass. At 56 years, he was a man of imposing stature, 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, slightly rotund, but the years had not softened the keen edge of his mind, nor had they dulled the deep, abiding faith that had guided him through decades of monastic life. Today, however, his faith would be tested in ways he could not yet imagine. A letter had arrived just a fortnight prior, sealed with the Archbishop's signet. Archbishop William Courtenay, newly returned from Rome, had chosen Elric to accompany him on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The honour was immense, almost beyond comprehension for a monk of his standing. But alongside the honour came a quiet, gnawing apprehension, a sense that he was leaving the familiar, safe confines of Canterbury for a journey that would take him to lands fraught with danger and uncertainty. Elric's hand rested for a moment upon the worn wooden cross that hung around his neck, a comfort as familiar as the stone walls of the abbey. He whispered a short prayer for guidance and protection, his breath misting in the cool morning air. "God grant me strength," he murmured, "to walk this path faithfully and to serve your servant William with all my heart." The streets were slowly coming to life. Vendors arranged their wares, hawking bread, cheese, and the odd trinket for travellers. Carts creaked along the cobblestones, pulled by oxen and mules, and the distant tolling of the cathedral bells called the faithful to morning prayers. Elric moved with deliberate calm, keeping to the shadows where he could, not from fear, but from a lifelong habit of humility. By mid-morning, the pilgrims began to assemble outside the abbey gates. Archbishop William was already mounted upon his donkey, a small, stoic creature with a serene bearing, much admired among the monks for its patient demeanour. The Archbishop's robe shimmered in the sun, a rich tapestry of deep crimson and gold, and his mitre caught the light with every tilt of his head. He was a man of resolute presence, yet approachable, and Elric had always found his guidance measured and wise. Even now, as he approached the Archbishop with his modest bundle of belongings, he felt a wave of deference tempered by a quiet affection. "Brother Elric," William greeted him, his voice warm but commanding. "I trust you are ready for the journey ahead?" Elric bowed low, keeping his gaze respectfully to the ground. "I am prepared, Your Grace. May the Lord grant me endurance for the road." A small procession of attendants, fellow monks, and a handful of laymen gathered behind them, their faces a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The road to Jerusalem was long and perilous, stretching across the Channel, through France and Italy, and eventually into the lands of the East. Few Englishmen undertook such pilgrimages, and fewer still returned unscathed. The first leg of the journey was to cross the English Channel. As the pilgrims made their way toward the port of Dover, Elric marvelled at the sight of the white cliffs rising stark and proud against the grey blue of the sea. The waves crashed rhythmically upon the rocks, and the briny air filled his lungs with a freshness he had rarely encountered beyond the abbey gardens. The crossing itself was uneventful, though the rocking of the ferry tested his sea legs, and he clutched the railing, murmuring prayers for safe passage. Once across, the continent unfolded before them like a vast tapestry of forests, rivers, and villages. Their travels were measured, punctuated by the tolling of bells and the recitation of prayers at mealtimes and rest stops. Elric found a quiet pleasure in observing the lands, in noting the way the people lived, the architecture of the towns, and the intricate patterns of the fields. But beneath his outward calm, a restlessness began to stir, a faint unease, a whisper at the edges of his thoughts. He dismissed it as fatigue, or the unfamiliarity of being away from Canterbury. Yet he could not shake the feeling that the journey would demand more than the endurance of body. It would demand the endurance of the soul. That night, as the pilgrims settled in a modest inn along the road to Calais, Elric lay upon his straw-filled mattress, the flickering candle casting long shadows across the rough-hewn walls. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, it brought with it a vision that made him start awake, sweat dampening his brow. In the dream, he saw fire licking at the walls of a church, the screams of the faithful echoing in the smoke-filled air. A shadowy figure moved through the flames, its eyes like coals, its mouth twisted in a silent scream. Elric awoke with a start, his heart pounding, and for a long moment he feared the fire was real, that the vision had crossed the threshold from dream to waking life. He rose and knelt beside his bed, whispering fervent prayers for protection, asking for guidance and discernment. "Lord," he murmured, "if this is a message, grant me the wisdom to understand it, and if it is but a fleeting fear, quiet my heart." By the time the first light of morning filtered through the small window, Elric felt no relief, only the lingering weight of unease. He dressed slowly, took his wooden staff, and joined the others at the breakfast table. Archbishop William, noticing the monk's pallor, gave him a gentle, questioning look. "You are troubled, Brother Elric?" William asked. "Only the weariness of travel, your grace," Elric replied, though he considered telling the Archbishop of his dream. For now, he kept the vision to himself, uncertain if it was a warning or a simple product of a mind unused to distant roads. As the group prepared to depart once more, Elric tightened his grip on his staff, aware that the road ahead was longer and more uncertain than any journey he had taken before. And deep within him, a shadow of foreboding lingered, like a faint wind warning of a storm yet to come. The pilgrimage had begun. The road from Calais wound through verdant fields and sleepy hamlets, the air tinged with the scent of damp earth and freshly turned soil. Elric Atherton, walking alongside the Archbishop, felt the steady rhythm of the pilgrimage settle into a meditative cadence. The monk's tall frame towered above many of the laymen and servants, his slightly rounded belly swaying with each measured step. Despite his size, his long legs carried him with surprising endurance, and his mind, ever vigilant, noted details others overlooked. The way the sunlight struck the bell tower of a distant village, the carefully tended vineyards along the slopes of hills, the children peeking from behind wooden shutters. Archbishop William's donkey plodded patiently beside the main group, its small hooves padding on the packed dirt road. William conversed occasionally with the travelling clergy, giving instructions on prayers, alms, and proper conduct. His voice carried the calm authority of a man seasoned by years of ecclesiastical responsibility. Yet beneath the calm exterior, Elric detected a keen intelligence, an ability to measure not only the dangers of the road, but the hearts of those who followed him. The first few days were marked by a serene rhythm. Breakfasts consisted of bread and cheese, with ale for those who could tolerate it, while suppers were modest affairs of pottage and stewed meats. Evenings were spent in prayer and reflection, the monks taking turns reading aloud from the Psalms or the Chronicles of Saints. Elric found comfort in these routines, Yet an unease had begun to grow like a slow ember in the corners of his mind. It began with fleeting shadows in his dreams. On the second night after crossing into Flanders, he dreamt of a church unlike any he had ever seen. Its walls were of stone blackened by smoke, and the air inside was thick with choking heat. He heard faint cries of terror, muffled and distant, yet unmistakably human. As he moved to reach them, the floor beneath him shifted and groaned, threatening to give way. He awoke with a start, heart hammering, sweat clinging to his hair. Yet when he opened his eyes, he was in the modest comfort of the inn, surrounded by the quiet breathing of his fellow pilgrims. He told himself it was the weariness of the journey, the unfamiliarity of foreign roads, and strange inns playing tricks upon his mind. But as the days progressed, the dreams returned with increasing clarity and intensity. At times he awoke convinced he could smell smoke or hear the faint crackle of flames. He began to notice subtle signs of illness among the serfs and attendants. Coughs, pallid faces, and quiet groans, though nothing appeared overtly serious at first. One afternoon, while crossing a narrow bridge over a swift river, Elric paused to watch the water rush below. The reflection of the sun danced on the surface, but he could not shake the memory of a shadowy figure he had glimpsed in a dream. A figure watching from the darkness, its eyes glowing with a terrible light. He shivered, clutching his staff tightly, and whispered a short prayer for guidance. That evening, he finally confided in Archbishop William, uncertain if he was overreacting. "Your Grace," he said quietly, as they settled near a fire outside the inn, "I have been troubled by dreams, strange visions, of fire, of walls crumbling, and figures, not of this world." William studied him for a long moment, the flickering firelight casting sharp shadows across his features. "Dreams are often the mind's response to change, Brother Elric," he said at last. "Do not read too much into them. You are far from Canterbury, far from the familiar routine of the Abbey. The road tests our bodies and our patience. It is not a message from God, only the weariness of travel." Elric nodded, though unease lingered like a bitter aftertaste. He bowed his head in prayer that night, seeking protection and clarity. Yet, as he drifted into sleep, the visions returned, sharper now. A church consumed by flames, the anguished cries of the faithful, shadows moving through smoke, and a figure, impossibly dark, observing all. He woke before dawn, muscles tense, heart racing. Over the next weeks, the group progressed through northern France and into the Low Countries. The roads were occasionally dangerous. Bandits were a persistent threat, though the presence of the Archbishop often ensured safe passage. Inns were simple and sometimes foul, and Elric found himself questioning the wisdom of leaving the comforts of Canterbury behind. Still, he pressed on, reminding himself that pilgrimage demanded endurance, humility, and faith. Yet the sickness among the pilgrims worsened subtly. A serf fell ill, and despite the prayers and ministrations of the monks, his condition deteriorated over days. Another developed a fever that left him delirious at night. Elric watched the proceedings with a growing sense of helplessness, recognizing that no amount of devotion seemed to stave off the suffering. The fire in his dreams grew brighter, hotter, and he began to fear that these visions were not mere figments of his imagination. One evening, as they camped near the outskirts of Liège, a quiet unease fell over the group. The Archbishop retired early, his small donkey kneeling patiently beside him. Elric, restless and troubled, walked along the edge of the campfire's glow, staring into the darkened woods beyond. He felt the first true pang of fear, not for himself, but for those in his charge. The visions in his sleep were no longer fleeting shadows. They were warnings. He knelt beside a small stream, splashing cold water onto his face, murmuring fervent prayers. "Lord, grant me wisdom," he whispered, "that I may protect those entrusted to me. Show me the path through darkness." But even as he prayed, he could feel the weight of something ancient, something malevolent, pressing just beyond the edges of perception. The pilgrimage continued. Elric moved among the pilgrims with the careful attention of a shepherd, tending the sick, offering prayers, and listening to confessions. Yet the shadows in his mind grew longer, the dreams more vivid, and a quiet dread settled in his chest. He did not know what awaited them beyond the borders of France, or what trials God intended to test him with. Only this he knew with certainty: the road to Jerusalem would demand more than endurance of body. It would demand the strength of his very soul. The road stretched endlessly through rolling hills and dense forests, the pilgrim's caravan a winding ribbon of cloaks, pack animals, and weary footsteps. Elric Atherton walked steadily among them, his staff thumping against the hard-packed earth. Tall and solemn, yet a knot of unease had begun to lodge in his chest. His dreams had returned with a fierceness that left him waking in sweat, heart hammering, and the shadows of the visions lingering long after dawn. It began with small details: embers dancing across stone floors, smoke curling unnaturally in the corners of his eyes. But each night the visions became more insistent, more vivid. Now he saw not just fires, but the tormented faces of the faithful trapped within, their mouths open in silent screams, hands clawing desperately at doors that would not give way. And always a shadow loomed, impossible in its darkness, eyes glowing like coals, mouth twisted into a silent scream that chilled him to the bone. On the 5th night of their march through the Ardennes, he awoke shivering, sweat and tears mingling upon his cheeks. He had dreamed that the Archbishop himself was trapped, lying ill upon a bed as flames consumed the church around him. Elric had reached for him, trying to lift him to safety, only to find the floor beneath giving way to fire and smoke. He bolted upright, the memory of falling into a blackened pit haunting him as he drew his breath in ragged gasps. "Brother Elric," a gentle voice called from the adjoining straw-filled sleeping area. One of the younger monks, Brother Thomas, had risen, alarmed by the rustling. "Are you unwell?" Elric shook his head, though his body still trembled. "Merely a dream," he said, voice tight. "Nothing more than the weariness of the road." But he knew in his heart it was more than that. The following days brought a creeping malaise to the pilgrims. At first it was subtle: coughs, pallor, languor, but soon entire serfs lay in their straw bedding, moaning softly, feverish, and beyond the reach of even the most fervent prayers. Elric moved among them tirelessly, offering water, medicine, and comfort, but the illness seemed impervious to the ministrations of the monks. He began to notice that the dreams, always dark, now included signs of the sickness, the same pallid faces he had seen in reality, mirrored in his visions of fire and shadow. Archbishop William, at first distant from the illness that afflicted the servants, now grew concerned. He called Elric aside one morning as they rode along a shaded road lined with oaks. "You seem troubled, brother," William said, his voice even but lined with concern. "I have heard whispers of your visions." Elric bowed his head. "Your Grace, the dreams, they have grown darker. I see fire consuming churches, shadows moving among the faithful, and the sick. They die despite our prayers. I do not know if it is warning, premonition, or some failing of my own mind." William considered him thoughtfully. "Dreams are a restless mind's companion, Elric. The road is long, and you have laboured far beyond your usual exertions. Fear is natural, but I caution you. Let not these visions cloud your judgment. Serve, pray, and leave the rest to God. Elric wanted to argue, to say that this was no mere imagination, but he did not. The Archbishop's calm reassured him, and he chose to put the matter aside, for now. Yet that night, in a small village inn along the Rhine, the dreams returned with a vengeance. Elric saw the flames again, hotter, hungrier, licking at stone and wood. He felt himself running through smoke-choked corridors, hearing the terrified cries of pilgrims and servants alike. Figures moved through the fire, indistinct yet terrifying, their forms blackened and twisted, and at their centre, a shadow larger than man, its eyes burning like embers, its mouth a cavern of darkness. He woke in a cold sweat, the sheets clinging to him, hands trembling as he clutched the wooden cross around his neck. The fire's heat lingered in his mind as if it had seared his very soul. He could not shake the feeling that these dreams were warnings, not merely of danger, but of events yet to come, events he might have the power to prevent if he could only discern their meaning. In the days that followed, more pilgrims fell ill. Brother Thomas, once spry and cheerful, lay in bed, shivering, murmuring incoherent prayers. A serf named Henry lost the use of his limbs, screaming in agony through the night. Elric's faith and endurance were tested, but he continued his ministrations with tireless devotion, offering prayers over the sick, carrying them to water, and whispering words of hope. Still, the shadow in his dreams grew nearer, more insistent. He began to see it in waking moments, at the edges of his vision, a flicker of darkness in the corner of an inn, a shadow that seemed to shift unnaturally when he turned his head. Elric did not speak of it to the others, fearing they would call him mad. One evening, as the group set camp near a dense forest, the Archbishop summoned him to ride beside him. William, growing ever more thoughtful with each day of the journey, asked quietly, "Elric, do you believe these dreams are of God's making?" Elric hesitated, gripping the reins of his own horse. "I do not know, Your Grace," he admitted, "but they feel real, and they speak of fire and suffering, shadows moving among the faithful. I fear the journey ahead may test more than our endurance. It may test the soul itself." William nodded slowly. "Then let us pray together. Strength and faith are our only shields, and I trust God will guide us." Elric bowed his head, feeling the weight of the pilgrimage settle heavily upon him. The road ahead stretched long and uncertain, winding through lands that were strange, foreign, and now tinged with foreboding. And as the first stars pierced the evening sky, he could not shake the certainty that his dreams were not idle fancies. They were warnings of the darkness that would soon engulf them. Sleep, when it came, offered no comfort. The fire, the shadows, the cries of the afflicted, they were all there, as vivid as the world outside his window. And somewhere deep within, Elric sensed the first true stirrings of fear, a fear that would follow him relentlessly, even as he walked the path toward Jerusalem. The landscape of Europe stretched out before the pilgrims like a vast living tapestry of stone, forest, and river. The road through the Rhineland was uneven and rocky, lined with tall oaks whose branches arched overhead like a cathedral in wood. Elric Atherton, walking beside a weary serf named Thomas, felt the weight of the journey pressing on him, not merely the miles of travel, but the mounting unease that now gnawed at his spirit. The sickness had grown worse. What had begun as a simple fever among the serfs now spread relentlessly, leaving pallid faces, glassy eyes, and hollowed cheeks in its wake. The monks moved tirelessly among the afflicted, offering prayers, ointments, and ministrations, but often the best they could do was hold a hand, murmur a prayer, and watch the flame of life flicker and fade. Elric had never seen so much quiet suffering, and each death left a mark upon his soul. He had taken to walking at the edges of the caravan in the early hours of the morning, watching the mist curl over fields and rivers, thinking on the dreams that had returned with renewed intensity. No longer were they fleeting shadows. Now they were vivid, almost corporeal in their terror. He saw fire engulfing churches, villagers screaming, and shadows that moved of their own accord, figures with horns and teeth sharp as knives, eyes glowing with malevolent light. One night, as the group camped near a small village outside Cologne, Elric's visions became unbearable. He dreamed that the Archbishop himself lay trapped in a burning chamber, fevered and weak, while shadowy figures moved closer, their laughter an unholy echo through the smoke. He tried to lift the Archbishop, to carry him to safety, but the floor beneath him opened into a pit of fire. His arms reached in desperation, but there was no purchase, no escape. He awoke with a start, sweat dampening his robes, heart racing. Around him the monks and pilgrims slept soundly, oblivious to the horror he had witnessed. Elric rose quietly, clutching his wooden cross and whispering prayers of protection. Lord, shield us from the darkness that stalks our path. Give me strength to guide those entrusted to me. The following days were tense and quiet. The group moved through fortified towns, crossing rivers by ferries and bridges, stopping only when fatigue or illness demanded rest. Each night Elric slept fitfully, haunted by visions that grew sharper and more detailed. He began to notice the pattern. The shadows always moved toward the sick, always towards the Archbishop, always towards something terrible waiting just beyond reach. The pilgrims began to murmur among themselves about the sickness. Some feared it was God's punishment, others suspected foul play. Elric listened carefully, offering comfort and guidance, but the fear gnawed at him. He knew, deep in his heart, that these were not idle worries. The dreams were warnings, and he feared the worst had yet to come. One evening, as they approached a small town along the Rhine, Archbishop William summoned him. "Brother Elric," he said, dismounting and brushing dust from his robe, "I have heard your concerns about these visions. Tell me, what is it that troubles you most?" Elric hesitated, then spoke. "Your Grace, the dreams, they are no mere illusions. I see fire consuming churches, shadows among the faithful, and the sick. They die despite our prayers. I fear the journey ahead may test us in ways beyond endurance." William studied him, the light of the setting sun glinting off his mitre. "We are on a pilgrimage," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "We must endure hardship, yes, but also maintain faith. Fear is a weapon of the devil, Brother Elric, and I trust that you will not let it rule your heart." Elric bowed his head, hiding the trembling in his hands. "As you command, Your Grace." Yet even as he spoke, he could feel the shadow pressing closer, the visions gnawing at the edges of his reason. That night, the dreams returned with a cruelty that left him shaking. He saw the faces of the pilgrims, twisted in terror as flames licked at the wooden beams of an inn. The shadow moved among them, larger and darker than ever, its eyes burning with a terrible hunger. And at the centre of the vision, he saw the Archbishop, fevered and weak, unable to rise, the flames drawing nearer. Elric woke with a gasp, the candlelight trembling across the walls of his chamber. The air seemed heavier, thicker, as if the shadows of the dream had followed him into waking life. He knelt by his bed, clutching the cross, whispering prayers, and begging for guidance. Lord, if this is a warning, grant me wisdom. If it is a test, grant me strength. And if it is both, deliver us from the darkness that approaches. The next morning, as they continued along the river, a new terror revealed itself. Brother Thomas, who had been ill for days, collapsed beside the road, his face pale, lips blue, and eyes rolling. Despite the prayers and care of the monks, he died before nightfall. Others grew weak, feverish, and delirious. Elric felt the weight of responsibility like a stone upon his chest. Every step, every mile seemed to carry them closer to some unseen doom. And yet, amid the fear and sickness, the pilgrimage pressed on. The roads were long, the inns crowded, and the nights filled with shadows that gnawed at the edges of his mind. He could no longer dismiss the visions as mere dreams. They were warnings. Warnings he did not yet fully understand, but could not ignore. The shadow was coming. He could feel it in every cough, every fevered groan, every flicker of candlelight in the inns where they rested. And though he did not know how, he knew the time would soon come when he would be called to act, to save not only the Archbishop, but the pilgrims entrusted to his care. The fires of vision were growing. The roads grew harsher as the pilgrims pressed eastward, the once gentle hills of the Rhineland giving way to rugged terrain and dense forests. Each day brought new challenges: swollen rivers, muddy paths, and the ever-present spectre of illness that had begun to claim lives among their ranks. Elric Atherton moved among the pilgrims with tireless devotion, his tall frame and broad shoulders a source of calm for those weaker than himself. But beneath his composed exterior, a storm of unease raged. The dreams had escalated. No longer were they merely warnings of fire or disease. They had begun to show figures of pure malice. Shadows with horns, mouths jagged with teeth sharp as razors, eyes glowing with a red light that seemed to pierce the soul. They prowled among the sick, their movements deliberate, cruel, and impossibly swift. Elric could feel them in the darkness, pressing at the edges of his mind even when awake. Each morning he rose with a weariness that no amount of prayer could soothe. It was during a rain-soaked morning along the banks of the Moselle that the first true death struck among the pilgrims. A serf named Edmund, fevered and trembling, gasped his last words before slipping away quietly in the mud. The Archbishop, who had been riding several paces ahead, dismounted immediately, kneeling beside the body and whispering prayers. Elric stayed back, hands clasped, struggling to steady the shaking in his fingers. He knew, with an unshakable certainty, that the shadow he had seen in his dreams had been among them, invisible yet present. That night they camped within the walls of a small monastery where monks offered beds and food to the weary travellers. Elric lay on a straw mattress, staring at the rafters above as the wind rattled the shutters. Sleep came fitfully, but when it did, the visions returned, more vivid and horrifying than ever. He saw the church ablaze, the flames clawing at the roof, licking at the walls, consuming the faithful within. Shadows moved among the terrified, their shapes grotesque and unnatural, while a figure, larger than any man, hovered over the Archbishop, pressing him to the floor. Elric's arms reached out in desperation, but the floor beneath him split open into a chasm of fire. His hands grasped at empty air. He awoke with a gasp, sweat plastering his robes to his skin, the echo of screaming pilgrims still ringing in his ears. Despite the intensity of the dreams, he did not tell the other monks. To speak them aloud would invite doubt, or worse, panic. Yet he could not shake the sense that what he saw in dreams was no longer a mere warning. It was prophecy. The shadow, he realized, was coming for the Archbishop. And soon. Over the following days, the sickness spread relentlessly. Serfs and lay attendants fell one by one, many beyond the reach of prayer. Elric laboured tirelessly, carrying water, administering herbs, and reciting prayers over the fevered and delirious. Each death gnawed at him, a fresh wound upon his soul. The pilgrims began whispering, fear etched into their faces. "A curse," one of the servants muttered, "or the hand of God testing us." Elric could not deny the truth he felt pressing upon him. Something unnatural, something malevolent stalked the group, and yet he could not abandon them. His faith demanded endurance, vigilance, and protection of those entrusted to his care. He prayed continuously, invoking saints and angels to guard the group, clinging desperately to the hope that God would provide strength to withstand the coming darkness. One evening, while travelling along a wooded path near Metz, Elric noticed a shadow among the trees, not cast by the moon or flickering lanterns, but moving independently, gliding across the forest floor with silent malevolence. He froze, heart pounding, eyes wide. For a long moment he could see nothing clearly, only the impression of a massive, horned figure with blazing eyes. Then it vanished. Elric's hands trembled as he gripped his staff, and he whispered prayers under his breath, the words choked with fear and urgency. "Lord, grant me discernment. Deliver us from the darkness that stalks us. Protect the Archbishop and shield these pilgrims from the evil that draws near." By the time the pilgrims reached the outskirts of Vienna, several more had succumbed to the disease. The Archbishop remained strong, though pale and fatigued, unaware of the terror pressing upon Elric's mind. Each night the visions grew more vivid. He could see the shadow press against the Archbishop's bed, its form looming, monstrous and malevolent, its intentions unmistakably cruel. Elric knew that the time would come when prayer alone would not suffice. He would need courage beyond what he had ever summoned, and wisdom beyond the ordinary bounds of men. The road to Jerusalem had already begun to test not just his body, but the very fabric of his soul. As he knelt by the campfire one night, the wind tugging at his robes, he allowed himself a moment of stark clarity. The darkness was real. The fire he had seen in dreams was real, and the shadow would soon strike. Only by vigilance, faith, and action could he hope to protect those entrusted to him. The pilgrimage had become no longer a journey of devotion alone. It had become a battle between light and shadow, between the faithful and the forces that sought to destroy them. Elric rose from the fire, staff in hand, and whispered once more, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped his heart. "Lord, I place us in your hands. Let your will be done, and give me the strength to walk through the fires you have set before us." The shadow was coming, and Elric knew it. The sun rose pale over the walls of Damascus, spilling light across the city's sandstone buildings, minarets, and crowded streets. For weeks the pilgrims had pressed through Anatolia and Syria, their journey increasingly arduous. The roads were rough and unwelcoming, the air heavy with the scent of spices, livestock and dust, and the pilgrims' pace slowed with each passing mile. Elric Atherton, ever vigilant, noticed the fatigue pressing heavily on the group. The serfs were frail and fevered, some barely able to walk, while the monks and lay attendants moved as best they could under the weight of supplies and provisions. The Archbishop, though appearing strong in the morning, had grown pale and quiet over the last few days, occasionally coughing into his hand, a faint sweat glistening on his brow. Elric's unease had grown alongside the Archbishop's health. The dreams that haunted him at night were no longer mere portents. They were vivid visions of terror and destruction. In the darkness of his inn-chamber, he saw the Archbishop lying weak upon a bed, shadows creeping through the room with burning eyes and jagged teeth. Fire licked the walls, thick smoke filling the air, and he could feel the heat on his skin, taste the ash in his throat. He awoke gasping, sweat soaking his robes, heart pounding like a hammer in his chest. The pilgrims arrived at a modest inn near the outskirts of the city, seeking rest and reprieve. Archbishop William dismounted his small donkey, his gait slower than usual, and Elric assisted him to a room within the inn's stone walls. "You must rest, your grace," Elric urged, his voice steady despite his own fear. "The journey has been long, and your strength must be preserved." William waved him off gently. "Nonsense, Brother Elric. I am strong. The road has tested us all, but my faith carries me forward. Fear not for me." Yet even as he spoke, Elric sensed the truth. The Archbishop's body was failing. Fever burned beneath his skin, and the flicker of his once commanding presence seemed diminished, subdued by illness. That night, Elric's visions returned with terrible clarity. He dreamed of a church, walls of stone and glass, engulfed in flames. The faithful within screamed, trapped by fire and smoke, and at the centre of it all, he saw William, fevered and weakened, lying helpless. A shadow moved through the smoke, impossibly dark, its eyes glowing like coals, its mouth a gaping maw of darkness. Elric tried to lift the Archbishop, tried to drag him to safety, but the floor beneath him gave way into a pit of fire. He awoke screaming, clutching the wooden cross around his neck, sweat and tears mingling on his cheeks. Outside, the night was still, the city silent except for the faint murmur of the innkeeper and the occasional bray of a donkey. Elric's heart raced, and he knelt beside the bed, whispering fervent prayers, pleading for guidance. "Lord, show me the path. Protect the Archbishop and these pilgrims. Grant me strength to withstand what is to come." The next day, William's condition worsened. His cough grew harsher, his movements slower, and a faint pallor settled across his features. Elric stayed close, offering water, administering simple remedies, and reciting prayers over him. Despite his efforts, the Archbishop seemed to fade, day by day, his body weakening under some unseen weight. Elric's dreams escalated as the days passed. He saw the fire again, hotter and more consuming, the smoke choking and thick. The shadow moved with greater purpose, its form larger, more terrifying. He saw himself trapped in the inferno, reaching for the Archbishop, only to find the floor beneath him giving way to the pit of flame. The visions left him exhausted, trembling, yet he could not ignore their warnings. One evening, as a soft dusk settled over Damascus, Elric approached William's bed. The Archbishop's small donkey waited quietly outside the door, faithful as ever. "Your Grace," Elric said softly, "you must rest, for your strength wanes, and the journey is not yet complete." William's eyes flickered toward him, a faint smile on his lips. "I trust you, Elric. Do not fear for me. Faith will see us through." Elric nodded, though doubt gnawed at his heart. Faith alone might not suffice. The shadows he had seen in dreams were no longer distant. They pressed closer, their intentions unmistakably clear. He could feel the darkness coiling in the corners of the room, a weight upon his soul that would not lift. As the night deepened, the inn fell silent. Elric knelt beside the Archbishop's bed, gripping the cross tightly, whispering prayers for protection, and steeling himself for the darkness to come. Outside, the streets of Damascus were quiet, the city unaware of the storm that pressed upon the pilgrims within. Inside, Elric knew the fire of his visions was imminent, and the shadow that haunted him drew ever nearer. He did not yet know how it would manifest, or what terrible choice he might soon be forced to make. Only this he knew with certainty: the The pilgrimage had become more than a journey of devotion. It had become a test of faith, courage, and endurance, one that would demand every ounce of his strength and the very core of his soul. The shadows were gathering, and the fire was coming. The morning sun rose weak and pale over Damascus, struggling to pierce the smoky haze that had begun to curl along the streets. Elric Atherton awoke with a sense of dread pressing at his chest. The visions of fire that had plagued him in dreams were no longer confined to sleep. They were near, palpable, and he could almost feel the heat in the air. The pilgrims had been assigned lodging within a small church on the outskirts of the city, a stone building adorned with modest stained glass and worn wooden pews. Archbishop William rested inside, feverish and weak, and the small donkey waited patiently outside the door, unaware of the approaching calamity. Elric moved quietly through the corridors, checking on the sick serfs and tending to the Archbishop's needs, all the while feeling a tension growing in his chest, as if the shadows from his dreams were gathering beyond the walls. It began with a faint smell of smoke, barely noticeable at first, curling through the corridors. Elric stiffened, heart hammering. He moved swiftly toward William's chamber, only to hear the first terrified cries echoing through the nave. Flames licked at the roof, smoke filling the building, thick and choking, and panic erupted among the pilgrims. "Elric!" a voice shouted. "The church is on fire!" He ran, eyes straining through the dense smoke, coughing and choking as the acrid air burned his lungs. His heart leapt to his throat when he saw the scene he had dreaded in his dreams. The Archbishop's bed lay near the centre of the church, William still fevered and weak, unable to rise on his own. Pilgrims struggled to escape, their faces streaked with soot and tears, while the fire consumed wooden pews and statues alike. Elric's mind raced. The floor beneath the Archbishop creaked ominously, heat licking from the cracks in the stone. There was no time to hesitate. Clutching his wooden cross in one hand, he grabbed William with the other. "Your Grace, hold on!" he shouted, pulling with all his strength, but the bed shifted dangerously as the floor began to splinter beneath them, smoke and flames pressing closer. The only option was desperate, forbidden, yet necessary. Elric's eyes fell on the large stained glass window depicting Christ in majesty. With a grim set to his jaw, he lifted his staff and smashed the glass, shards scattering across the floor, and climbed through the jagged opening. The cool air of the courtyard outside was like a balm against the burning smoke, yet he could not pause. He hoisted William onto his broad shoulders, staggering toward a large pond at the edge of the grounds. An old eel pond, murky, but the only safe landing. The Archbishop, shocked by the fall, let out a scream as Elric leapt with him into the water. The impact left Elric bruised, a cracked rib screaming with pain, but William's body thrashed violently, and the cold water seemed to awaken him. "By God's mercy!" Elric gasped, struggling to drag William to the shallows. "Hold fast, Your Grace." The pilgrims gathered in the courtyard, coughing and soot-streaked, as others helped pull the sick from the fire. Elric remained bent over the Archbishop, shouting for assistance, praying fervently that his desperate act had not condemned him in God's sight for breaking the sacred window. Yet as William coughed and spluttered, the Archbishop's eyes fluttered open, weak but alive. Later, as the fire was brought under control, it became clear that the blaze had been set deliberately. Someone had torched the church, and the group realized that the pilgrimage had already drawn the attention of darker forces than mere disease or misfortune. The Archbishop was moved to another church for medical care, while the remaining pilgrims tended to the injured and assisted with the monastic duties of the surviving clergy. Elric sat by the pond, water dripping from his robes, his body aching, mind racing. He had saved the Archbishop, But the visions had not ceased. They had only grown stronger, more insistent, showing not just fire, but demonic figures pressing upon the faithful, and now an unmistakable focus on William himself. The shadows had followed them. That night, as Elric lay on a cot in the temporary lodging, he whispered prayers that ran long into the night. Lord, grant me discernment. Protect your servant William and these pilgrims from the darkness that hunts us. And if my sins have condemned me, forgive me this one act in your name. He knew, deep within his soul, that the pilgrimage was no longer merely a test of endurance or faith. It was a battle against forces that could not be seen with the eyes alone, a spiritual trial that would demand every ounce of courage, faith, and wisdom he possessed. Outside, the city slept, oblivious to the shadows gathering, to the fire and malevolence that had already touched the pilgrims. But inside Elric's mind, the fire burned on, and the shadow loomed ever closer, its eyes fixed on the Archbishop, its intent unmistakably cruel. And Elric, tall, broad-shouldered, and yet humanly vulnerable, steeled himself for what was to come. The pilgrimage had become a crucible, and he was at its centre. The morning after the fire in Damascus, the air was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of charred wood. The church lay in ruins, the stained glass shattered, pews blackened, and remnants of altar cloths smouldering. Pilgrims and monks alike moved cautiously through the wreckage, helping the injured and consoling the terrified. The Archbishop had been moved safely to another nearby church, tended by local clergy and attended carefully by Elric, whose cracked rib throbbed with every movement. The group quickly realised that the blaze had not been accidental. Evidence of deliberate arson was everywhere. Broken locks, traces of pitch and straw carefully stacked, and a faint smell of oil that burned even after the fire was quenched. Whispers ran through the pilgrims, each more fearful than the last. Who would do this? One servant murmured. Why target the Archbishop? Elric walked among the survivors, tall and broad in the midst of the weary crowd, staff in hand. He helped tend minor injuries, comforted the sick, and offered prayers to the Almighty, but his thoughts remained focused on the fire. The visions he had suffered in dreams now seemed to merge with reality, their intensity frightening in its clarity. He thought of the shadow, dark and immense, with eyes that burned like coals and a mouth jagged with teeth. It had appeared in his dreams at the heart of the fire, moving among the terrified pilgrims, pressing its malevolent will upon William. Elric could not dismiss the sense that his visions had been warnings, and that the danger was far from over. The Archbishop, though shaken, was recovering under careful medical attention. Elric remained close, attending to William's needs with the same tireless devotion that had carried him through weeks of pilgrimage and nights of fire-haunted visions. Yet he could not ignore the creeping sense of dread. The arson was no isolated incident. Someone wanted to harm them, to strike at the heart of their pilgrimage. In the days following the fire, the pilgrims assisted the local monks with the restoration of the church and the care of survivors. Elric moved among the tasks with practiced diligence, helping to rebuild, clean and restore, all the while watching the sick with a careful eye. His own body ached, the cracked rib throbbed, bruises lined his arms and legs, but his mind remained sharp, aware of the gathering darkness both in dreams and in the waking world. Despite their efforts, Elric's visions continued to worsen. Each night the shadow appeared in his sleep, closer, more threatening, its eyes fixed on William, its form larger, more monstrous. He dreamed of the Archbishop being dragged through fire, screams echoing in corridors of smoke and stone. Sometimes the shadow spoke, not in words but in intentions, pressing an invisible weight upon the faithful that left them trembling, and unable to act. One evening, as Elric sat by the Archbishop's bedside, he spoke cautiously. "Your Grace, the fire, someone set it deliberately. I fear that this journey may be threatened not by chance, but by men who wish us harm." William's gaze was calm, though lined with exhaustion. "Then we shall endure as we have endured thus far," he said. "Faith will guide us, and God will protect us. Fear not, Elric, we are in his hands." Elric bowed his head, praying silently for wisdom and courage. Yet deep in his heart, he knew that the threat was not merely mortal. The shadow in his dreams was relentless, and each night its presence grew stronger. It was no longer a distant warning. It was a force that seemed to anticipate their every movement, pressing ever closer to the Archbishop and the pilgrims. Among the surviving monks, speculation ran rampant. Some whispered of rival clerics, others of thieves or mercenaries, but no one could explain the darkness that haunted Elric's mind or the strange, almost supernatural quality of his visions. Only he knew the full extent of the threat, and he felt the burden of responsibility settle more heavily upon him with each passing day. The pilgrims remained in Damascus for several more days, assisting with rebuilding, tending to the sick, and awaiting the Archbishop's full recovery. Elric took his duties seriously, but the visions grew ever more vivid, now showing not only fire and shadow, but death and torment. He began to glimpse himself within the flames, struggling, reaching for something or someone just beyond reach. He prayed continually, asking God to grant him strength, to reveal the meaning of these visions, and to protect those entrusted to his care. Yet despite his faith, he could not shake the sense that a darker force was at work, one that would test not only the pilgrims' bodies, but the very souls of those who travelled with them. By the time the Archbishop was strong enough to continue the journey, the group was weary but resolute. Elric, though battered and bruised, remained vigilant. The fire in Damascus had been survived, but the shadow that haunted his dreams had not been defeated. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that greater trials lay ahead, and that the pilgrimage's true danger was only beginning. As they prepared to leave the city, Elric cast a final glance back at the ruined church, the faint smoke still rising from the blackened stones. The fire had been a warning, a test of courage and faith, and he, tall and broad-shouldered, weary and battered, knew that he could not yet rest. The shadow waited, and the road to Jerusalem still stretched long and perilous before them. The pilgrims left Damascus with heavy hearts, the memory of the fire still lingering in their minds. Elric Atherton rode near the front of the group, tall and vigilant, staff in hand, his eyes scanning every shadowed alley and crumbling building along the route. The Archbishop, still recovering from his fever, rode beside him on the faithful donkey, weak but resolute. Yet the unease that had plagued Elric's dreams was no longer confined to sleep. Each night the visions grew darker, more precise, and almost prophetic. He saw the Archbishop being attacked by figures that were not of this world, shapes that lurked at the edges of the church, horns curling from their heads, eyes ablaze, mouths wide with jagged teeth. The scenes were accompanied by the smell of smoke and ash, and the faint screams of men, women, and children writhing in torment. One morning, the group awoke to a scene that confirmed Elric's worst fears. 2 monks had been murdered overnight, their bodies discovered in the dim light of dawn, faces frozen in terror, throats slashed, and eyes staring sightlessly into the sky. The group shuddered, whispers of fear and disbelief spreading like wildfire. "It cannot be bandits," muttered one of the pilgrims, voice trembling. "No coin was taken, no one approached them. Who would commit such an act?" Elric's tall frame towered over the gathering crowd, his mind racing. He had dreamed of shadows and fire, of malevolent forces moving among the faithful. Now, in the waking world, death had arrived as though carried on wings of his visions. He knelt briefly beside the bodies, whispering prayers for their souls, and felt the creeping weight of responsibility pressing upon him. Later that day, a nun, Sister Beatrice, reported seeing shadowy figures leaving the church grounds under cover of darkness. They moved like shadows, she said, voice shaking. Silent, quick, and impossible to catch. I could see nothing but their shapes and the terrible intent in their movements. Elric's heart sank. The fire in Damascus, the sickness, and now murder. It was all connected, and the force behind it was not mortal. He could feel the shadow in his bones, pressing at the edges of his consciousness. Relentless, patient, waiting. That night, as he lay upon his cot, the visions returned with a clarity that left him trembling. He saw William lying in a darkened chamber, shadows pressing closer, wrapping around the Archbishop as if to drag him into some unholy pit. Elric's arms reached out in desperation, but the floor beneath them split into flames. He screamed silently, clutching the cross around his neck, whispering prayers with the fervour of a man whose soul depended upon it. Sleep offered no solace. Each dream ended with the Archbishop being seized, the shadow looming over him, triumphant, while Elric struggled in vain. The visions left him shaking, but they also left him resolute. He knew the time would come when he must act, not only to protect the Archbishop, but to confront the darkness that had been stalking them across the lands of Europe and into Syria. The group pressed on, their spirits dampened by fear, yet their faith remained. Elric, now the oldest and wisest of the surviving monks, took on the mantle of responsibility, organising watches, ensuring the sick were tended, and guiding the pilgrims with steady hands. Yet in the quiet moments, when he was alone with his thoughts, he could feel the shadow pressing closer, and he knew that the coming trials would test not just endurance but the very core of his soul. As the caravan moved through the desert roads toward Jerusalem, the shadows followed, unseen but ever present. Elric's dreams became a map of impending terror, each night revealing new horrors, fire, death, and the Archbishop at the mercy of forces beyond mortal comprehension, and he, though weary and bruised, knew that he could not falter. The pilgrimage had become a crucible, and he alone seemed aware of the full scale of the trials that awaited them. In the flickering candlelight of his chamber that night, he whispered a prayer unlike any he had said before. Lord, if this is your test, grant me strength. If it is your will to test my faith through darkness, let me endure. And if my soul must stand between evil and those entrusted to me, let it not falter. The shadows were patient. They were coming for the Archbishop, for the pilgrims, and as the dreams had warned, they would not wait long. The desert wind cut across the caravan as it pressed onward toward Jerusalem, carrying with it a dry, suffocating heat that drained the strength from men and beasts alike. Elric Atherton, once steady and commanding in his presence, now moved slowly, clutching his staff as fever crept through his body. His rib, still cracked from the fall in Damascus, throbbed with every step, each breath a reminder of his fragility. The illness came upon him gradually. Chills, sweats, dizziness, and a malaise that left him trembling and disoriented. For days he struggled to maintain his duties, urging the pilgrims forward, tending the sick and keeping a vigilant watch, yet with each passing mile the shadow that had haunted his dreams grew stronger, more insistent, and now it seemed to reach for him personally. Night after night the visions tormented him. He saw himself being dragged through smoke and fire, clawed and torn by monstrous horned figures. The Archbishop was there, but often at a distance beyond his reach, while Elric himself was trapped, powerless, the flames licking at his robes, the shadows pressing closer, whispering promises of torment and despair. Each awakening left him gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, and trembling with a fear that gnawed at the edges of his faith. During the day, the pilgrims noticed his pallor, the way he leaned on his staff more heavily, and the quiet grimness etched into his features. William, though still recovering, kept a concerned eye on him. "Brother Elric," he said one morning, "you do not look well. You must rest, lest the pilgrimage's trials overwhelm you." Elric forced a weak smile. "I am weary, your grace, yet the pilgrims need guidance. I cannot falter." He paused, swallowing hard against the dry throat of fever. "Nor can I abandon the watch over your safety." That evening he lay on his cot, visions returning with a ferocity that left him paralyzed. The shadow was now unmistakable. A towering form, eyes glowing like molten coals, teeth jagged, horns curling above its head. It reached for him directly, and for the first time he saw himself on a great black throne of fire, the souls of the pilgrims swirling around him, threatened by the darkness, while his own fate dangled precariously. He screamed aloud, clutching his cross, feeling the weight of both the fever and the terror pressing upon him. "Lord, protect us. Grant me strength. Guard these pilgrims." His voice echoed across the empty night, the desert silence pressing in. The fever worsened. Each day his steps became more laboured, his voice weaker, his body shaking under the relentless sun. Yet even in his physical weakness, his mind remained acutely aware of the growing threat. The shadow was not a dream alone. It was a prophecy, a warning, and perhaps even a test of his own soul. Despite his illness, he continued to lead the group. He watched over the sick, tended to the wounded, and guided the pilgrims through treacherous paths, desert sands, and broken roads. His own suffering seemed to sharpen his vigilance. He knew that any lapse could be catastrophic, that the shadow he had glimpsed in visions could strike at any moment. By the time the group approached the outskirts of Jerusalem, Elric's body had weakened further. The pilgrims assisted him when necessary, noting the pallor of his skin, the sunken hollows under his eyes, and the faint tremor in his hands. Yet despite his frailty, his mind remained clear enough to anticipate dangers, to prepare, and to pray. Nightfall brought new terror. He dreamed of a church consumed by fire, the shadow looming above him and the Archbishop. This time, however, the visions focused entirely on him. He saw himself being torn from the living, dragged into darkness, while the pilgrims watched helplessly. The sensation of falling, of being crushed beneath impossible weight, of fire and shadow pressing upon him, left him gasping in his sleep. He awoke in panic, clutching the cross to his chest, praying for hours until the first light of dawn. The desert winds whispered through the tents, carrying dust and sand, and he knew that the pilgrimage's trials were nearing their peak. His own soul seemed to hang in the balance, and the path to Jerusalem had become a crucible that tested body, mind, and spirit alike. Yet even as his strength waned, his faith did not. Each step he took, each prayer he whispered, was an act of defiance against the darkness that sought him. He could feel the shadow waiting, patient and relentless, yet he resolved to meet it not with fear, but with the courage and devotion that had carried him this far. The pilgrimage had brought sickness, fire, and death. It had brought shadows that whispered of despair, and now it had brought him to the edge of his own mortality. But Elric Atherton, tall, weary and fevered, would not yield. He would reach Jerusalem, or he would confront the shadow that awaited him there. The walls of Jerusalem rose before the pilgrims like an enduring testament of faith and history, their stones warmed by the afternoon sun, and their gates bustling with merchants, travellers and clergy. For Elric Atherton, the sight should have been a comfort, a sign of the pilgrimage's end, yet his body ached with fever. His cracked rib throbbed with every breath, and his mind trembled with the weight of the visions that had followed him across deserts and kingdoms. By the time they entered the city, Elric could scarcely walk. Pilgrims and monks supported him on either side, his staff offering little relief against the waves of exhaustion and illness that gripped him. Even the Archbishop, recovered but wary, placed a hand on Elric's shoulder. "You have led us well, brother," William said quietly. "Rest now. You have earned it." Elric nodded, too weak to speak, and was carried to a modest lodging near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There he was laid upon a cot, draped with coarse linen, and tended by younger monks who fussed over him with whispered prayers and ministrations. His body ached, his fevered brow burned, and for the first time in the pilgrimage, he felt utterly powerless. Night fell, and with it came the darkness that had haunted his dreams. The shadows that had stalked him across continents pressed against the edges of his consciousness, and for the first time he could feel them in the waking world. As he drifted into uneasy slumber, a movement caught his eye, a faint ripple of darkness along the floor of his chamber. The shadow took form, towering, immense, with eyes that burned like coals and teeth sharp as razors. It leaned over him, crushing the air from his lungs. Elric tried to cry out, but the weight of its presence pressed him to the cot, immobile, gasping. Panic clawed at him, yet he remembered the prayers and chants that had sustained him on the road. He forced his voice, rasping and strained, into a chant meant to repel demons. Exorcizo te, creature maligna, in nomine Domini. The shadow shrieked, a sound like grinding stone and burning metal, its form recoiling slightly, as if pained by the words. Elric seized his cross, thrusting it toward the darkness. The shadow hissed, recoiling further, then melted back into the corners of the room, leaving the cot trembling beneath him. For several nights this pattern repeated. Each evening the shadow returned, stronger and more insistent. Each night Elric rose, chant on his lips, cross in hand, pushing the darkness away from himself and the pilgrims who slept unaware nearby. Yet with each passing night, the struggle left him weaker, fevered, and increasingly convinced that the shadow's intent was not merely to frighten, it sought his very soul. On the fifth night, the shadow's assault escalated. The church around him seemed to ignite in his vision, flames consuming altars, pews, and pilgrims. Chanting and the cross were no longer enough to repel the force. They only drove it back temporarily. The entity's voice, low and resonant, filled the chamber with an unbearable sound. A promise, a demand. Your soul or theirs. Elric's heart froze. He could not, would not surrender the souls of those entrusted to his care. Yet his own soul hung in the balance, threatened, powerless to resist if he yielded. He struck at the shadow with his cross, driven by faith and desperation, the room shaking with the battle between mortal courage and infernal will. Hours, or perhaps days, passed in the struggle, no one seeing, no one hearing, only him and the shadow locked in combat. Finally, exhausted, he collapsed beneath a large carving of Christ on the cross, flames crackling around him in his vision. The shadow hovered above, eyes blazing, teeth bared. Your soul, or theirs, It hissed again. Elric whispered, barely audible, "Take mine." Darkness fell, suffocating, and for a long moment he felt as though eternity itself had passed. Then, light. He awoke in Jerusalem, the morning sun spilling through the window, warmth on his fevered skin. Archbishop William stood by his side, healthy and alive, the faithful donkey waiting outside. "Brother Elric," William said softly, "you were ill. We feared for a time that we had lost you, but God has returned you to us from your slumber." Elric, trembling, glanced at his own hands, his body whole, the fire of his visions gone. "Am I dead?" he whispered, voice hoarse. "No," William replied, "but God has allowed you to endure a trial beyond comprehension. Your faith has carried you, brother. You are spared, and so are all entrusted to you." Elric's heart swelled with gratitude and relief. The pilgrimage, more arduous than he could have imagined, had tested his courage, his faith, and his soul itself. Yet he had endured. The shadow had come close, had demanded all, but he had not faltered. And in Jerusalem, the pilgrimage's end, he knew that his faith had been preserved, and his soul saved from the darkness that sought it. Jerusalem was alive with the sounds of prayer, bells tolling across the rooftops, merchants haggling, and pilgrims murmuring as they filed past the holy sites. Yet inside the modest lodging where Elric Atherton rested, the air was thick with a tension that no city noise could penetrate. His body was weakened from fever and toil, but his mind remained sharp, aware of the shadow that had followed him across kingdoms, deserts, and seas. For nights he had been attacked, the demon pressing against him, testing his courage, threatening his soul. Now, in the heart of the city, the shadow's assault reached its zenith. The visions were no longer dreams. They were almost physical, filling his chamber with darkness that had weight, with eyes that blazed and a mouth filled with teeth that promised torment. On the fifth night, the assault intensified. Elric awoke to the sound of a low, grinding shriek that vibrated through the walls of his lodging. He tried to rise, clutching his cross, but the shadow loomed larger than ever, filling the room with smoke, heat, and a stench of brimstone. Its eyes glowed like molten fire, and horns twisted above its head as it leaned toward him, crushing the air from his lungs. "Your soul, or theirs," it hissed, voice deep, resonant, echoing in his very bones. Elric's mind raced. He could not, would not surrender the souls of the pilgrims, now so close to the completion of their journey. Yet the shadow's threat was absolute, and he could feel his strength failing. He fell to his knees, chanting with every ounce of faith he possessed. "Exorcizo te, creature maligna, in nomine Domini, in virtute crucis et nominis sancti, recede." The shadow shrieked, recoiling slightly, but pressed back relentless. Fire ignited around the room in his vision, consuming altars and pews, the screams of pilgrims rising around him. Each strike of his cross, each chant drove it back, but only temporarily. Hours, or perhaps days, passed. Elric's body ached, fevered and broken, yet he refused to relent. The shadow's final offer rang through the chamber, terrifying in its simplicity. "Your soul, or theirs." Beneath a carved crucifix surrounded by flames and smoke in his vision, Elric whispered the words that carried the weight of salvation. "Take mine." Darkness engulfed him. The sensation of falling, of being crushed beneath impossible weight, was complete. Time itself seemed to stretch into eternity, and yet when light returned, Elric awoke in Jerusalem, whole and unharmed. His cot was cool beneath him, sunlight streaming through the window. The fever had broken, the bruises had faded, and the pain in his rib was gone. Archbishop William knelt beside him, eyes filled with relief. "Brother Elric," he said softly, "we feared for you, but God has spared you. Your trials have been greater than any man should endure, yet your faith has been steadfast." Elric, trembling, clutched his cross. "Am I safe?" he whispered, voice hoarse from the struggle. William smiled gently. "You are not only safe, but strengthened. God has tested you, and you have endured. Your soul is preserved, and those entrusted to you remain protected. Faith carried you through fire, shadow, and despair." The pilgrims, who had been unaware of the full extent of the trials, gathered around him, offering quiet blessings, prayers, and tears of relief. The city's walls, the holy sites, and the distant hills bore witness to a journey that had been far more than a simple pilgrimage. It had been a crucible of the soul. Elric rose slowly, leaning on his staff, his tall frame restored in dignity, if not in strength. He looked out over Jerusalem, feeling the weight of all he had endured. Sickness, fire, murder, shadows, and the threat of eternal damnation, all had been tests, and he had survived. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to breathe fully, to feel relief, and to know that faith had triumphed over fear, devotion over despair. The shadow, the fire, and the visions that had haunted him for months had been trials, and in overcoming them, he had emerged whole, both in body and in spirit. The pilgrimage was complete, but more than that, Elric Atherton understood now the true depth of his faith. It was not merely a journey to Jerusalem, but a journey through fire, shadow, and the very test of the soul itself. And having endured, he knew that he had been preserved for a purpose greater than any mortal could measure. He knelt one final time, cross in hand, voice clear and unwavering. "Lord, I am yours. Thank you for carrying me through the darkness, for preserving my soul, and for guiding me to your light. May this faith endure as long as my days." And in Jerusalem, beneath the sun and amidst the faithful pilgrims, the shadow was gone, the fires were extinguished, and the soul of Elric Atherton, pilgrim and monk, was at last at peace. Jerusalem, bathed in morning light, felt almost otherworldly after the long, arduous journey the pilgrims had endured. For Elric Atherton, each stone of the city bore witness not only to centuries of faith, but to the trials he had personally survived. Fever, fire, shadows, and visions of damnation had tested his body and soul beyond what he had thought possible. Now, as the pilgrims prepared to return to England, he found himself in quiet contemplation, weighing the lessons of the pilgrimage against the harsh realities of mortality and faith. Archbishop William had fully recovered, his health restored by careful attention and prayer. The pilgrims, weary but unbroken, moved through the streets with a sense of accomplishment tempered by grief for the lives lost along the way. The two murdered monks and the serfs who had succumbed to illness were remembered in daily prayers, their souls entrusted to God. Elric often found himself pausing in the chapels, murmuring words of supplication for them, feeling the weight of responsibility that had been placed upon him. The journey home would be long, and the monks busied themselves with preparations. Supplies were replenished, horses rested, and routes carefully planned. Elric, still tall and imposing despite his frailty, moved among the group, offering guidance, checking provisions, and ensuring that the pilgrims were ready for the desert and the mountains they would have to traverse again. His body ached, but his spirit carried the resilience forged in fire and shadow. In quiet moments he reflected upon the visions that had haunted him. The shadow, the fire, the threats against the Archbishop and the pilgrims. It was all real. A test of faith unlike any he had experienced. He thought of the night when he had whispered, "Take mine," and the crushing darkness that had surrounded him. And he understood now that it had been a crucible, a trial designed to separate the faithful from fear, devotion from despair. Even so, Elric's mind remained vigilant. The memory of those dark visions lingered, a reminder that evil could manifest in forms unseen, and that faith must be constant and unyielding. He prayed continually, not only for the pilgrims but for himself, asking for guidance in the months and years to come, and for the wisdom to lead and protect those under his care. One evening, as the sun set over the rooftops of Jerusalem, painting the city in gold and crimson, Elric knelt on a stone terrace overlooking the valley below. He clasped his hands, holding the wooden cross close to his chest. "Lord," he whispered, "I have seen darkness beyond imagining. I have faced shadow and fire, sickness and death. Yet you have preserved me, your servant. Grant that I may continue to walk in your light, that I may serve with humility and courage, and that my soul remain steadfast through all trials to come." Archbishop William approached quietly, placing a reassuring hand on Elric's shoulder. "You have endured far more than any mortal should, brother. Your courage and faith have carried us all. You have been a shield, a guide, and a light in darkness." Elric bowed his head, feeling the weight of both exhaustion and gratitude. "It is only by your grace, and by God's mercy that I have endured. I am unworthy, yet I am grateful." As the pilgrims prepared for departure, Elric took stock of what had been lost and what had been preserved. The journey had claimed lives, tested faith, and confronted him with shadows of the soul. Yet it had also strengthened resolve, deepened devotion, and revealed the power of steadfast belief. When the caravan finally began its slow march toward the coast, Elric walked among the pilgrims, staff in hand, guiding the weary and ensuring the sick were tended. Each step was measured, deliberate, but within him burned a renewed sense of purpose. The shadow that had haunted him, the fire that had threatened them all, and the visions of damnation, all had been overcome through faith and endurance. Though the road ahead was long, and though the memories of darkness would remain, Elric understood that the pilgrimage had fundamentally transformed him. He had walked through fire and shadow, faced death, and yet his soul remained intact. The trials of Jerusalem had tested him to the limit, and in emerging from them, he had become a vessel of faith, capable of guiding others and surviving the unknown challenges that life might yet bring. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the city in violet and gold, Elric Atherton, monk and pilgrim, felt a deep and abiding peace. The journey had been perilous, terrifying, and almost unendurable, yet he had endured. And as the first stars appeared above Jerusalem, he knew that faith, courage, and devotion had carried him through the darkest of nights and would continue to guide him on the long road home. The return journey from Jerusalem was quieter than the journey east. The pilgrims moved with a tempered rhythm, each step measured, aware of the distance yet buoyed by the knowledge that their pilgrimage had reached its climax. Elric Atherton, though still tall and slightly stooped from illness and fatigue, walked with a renewed sense of purpose. Each morning he rose with prayer on his lips, staff in hand, guiding the weary through the deserts, mountains and rivers that had once challenged them so cruelly. The shadows that had haunted him across the journey east were gone. No fire threatened them now. No monstrous figures appeared in dreams. Yet Elric knew that their influence remained as a memory, a lesson etched into the soul. He reflected often on the darkness he had faced, on the moments when despair pressed closest, and on the nights when he had whispered, "Take mine." Those memories were both haunting and affirming, a reminder of the fragility of life and the resilience of faith. Archbishop William rode alongside him during long stretches of the road, strong and serene, the faithful donkey never far from his side. The Archbishop often spoke quietly, sharing words of comfort and encouragement. "Brother Elric," he said one morning as the group forded a swollen river, "you have carried more than any man should, yet you have endured. Your vigilance has saved us all, and your faith has guided our journey." Elric bowed his head, feeling the weight of gratitude and humility. "It was by God's grace and your grace's guidance that we have survived, your grace. The trials were many, and my own faith was tested, yet we endure." The pilgrims themselves were changed. They spoke less of fear and more of gratitude, of the mercy that had seen them through the sickness, the fire, and the shadows. Stories of Elric's courage, carrying the Archbishop through the flaming church in Damascus, enduring fever and visions in the desert, and facing the shadow in Jerusalem, were told in hushed tones around the campfires. Many whispered prayers of thanks for his guidance and protection, recognizing him as both a leader and a spiritual guardian. Elric, tall and slightly portly, moved among them with quiet diligence. He checked the health of each pilgrim, administered simple remedies, and offered counsel and prayer. Though the body ached, the bruises still tender, he felt an inner strength that had been forged in the crucible of the pilgrimage. The trials had refined him, sharpened his faith, and deepened his understanding of divine providence. Nights were still fraught with contemplation. Though the shadow no longer appeared, Elric remained vigilant, praying over the pilgrims as they slept, feeling the lingering weight of the experiences that had almost claimed him. He reflected on the journey from Canterbury to Jerusalem and back, the disease that claimed lives, the church that burned, the demonic visions, and the ultimate confrontation with the darkness. All of it had been a test, a measure of faith, courage, and devotion. As the caravan approached the coast, the Mediterranean gleamed under the afternoon sun. Ships awaited to carry the pilgrims across the Channel to England. Elric looked toward the horizon, a sense of completion mingled with exhaustion in his heart. The pilgrimage had been far more arduous than any of them could have imagined, yet they had survived. Faith had carried them through fire, shadow, and despair. On the deck of the ship, he watched the waves churn beneath them, sea spray cooling his fevered skin. Pilgrims prayed, murmured blessings, and shared quiet smiles of relief and camaraderie. Elric knelt briefly, crossing himself, and whispered words of thanks. "Lord, you have guided us through darkness. You have preserved our souls and granted us safe passage. May your mercy continue to watch over us, and may we return to our homes with hearts full of faith and humility." Though the journey home would take weeks, perhaps months, each mile felt lighter, each day brighter. The shadows of Damascus and Jerusalem remained in memory, but they no longer held power. Elric had faced fire, demons, and despair, and his soul had endured. That endurance, he knew, was the gift of God's mercy and the reward of unwavering faith. As the coastline of England appeared, green and familiar, the pilgrims murmured prayers of thanks. Elric's heart swelled with relief and humility. Canterbury awaited, their homecoming marking the end of a pilgrimage that had tested the very limits of human endurance and spiritual resilience. Yet in surviving, guiding, and protecting those entrusted to him, Elric Atherton had achieved something far greater than mere survival. He had strengthened faith, preserved souls, and borne witness to the power of unwavering devotion. Tall, slightly chubby, and weathered beyond his 56 years, Elric stood at the bow of the ship, eyes on the horizon, staff in hand, cross around his neck. The wind carried the scent of home, and in his heart a quiet certainty. The pilgrimage had been a trial by fire, shadow, and darkness, but faith had triumphed. The rolling hills of England appeared over the horizon, green and familiar, a balm to the weary pilgrim's eyes. The Channel crossing had been uneventful, the sea calm, as if granting them safe passage after months of peril. Elric Atherton stood at the prow, tall and broad despite the lingering fatigue of fever, bruises, and long months of toil. The weight of the pilgrimage still pressed upon him, but his heart carried a profound sense of relief and humility. Canterbury itself welcomed them in quiet fanfare. The cathedral bells tolled, echoing across the streets, and pilgrims and townsfolk gathered to witness the return of Archbishop William and his company. Elric, guided by a mixture of exhaustion and reverence, followed closely behind, his staff tapping the stone streets in measured rhythm. Weeks later, a messenger arrived at Canterbury with a letter bearing news from the monastery in Damascus, where the 2 monks had been murdered. The report detailed the discovery of a man who had attempted to kidnap another monk shortly after Elric and his company had departed. Within his possessions were dark books, texts of forbidden rituals, and instructions invoking demons and infernal forces. The man had confessed, under interrogation and divine authority, that he had been sent to disrupt Elric Atherton's journey, to interfere with the pilgrimage, to prevent the salvation of his soul, and to claim the Archbishop and the faithful for darkness. He spoke of Elric by name, detailing how his interventions had been thwarted by the monk's courage and faith, describing the mysterious resilience and moral fortitude that had protected the pilgrims. Justice, harsh but certain in those days, followed swiftly. The man was condemned as a heretic, a practitioner of diabolical arts, and was publicly crucified, his death a grim testament to the victory of faith over evil. The monastery at Damascus, though scarred by the murders and arson, continued its work under vigilant eyes, the surviving monks rededicating themselves to prayer and service, their grief tempered by the knowledge that the darkness had been confronted and defeated. Elric read the letter in quiet contemplation, his hand resting on the wooden cross that had never left his neck. He knelt in the modest chamber of the Canterbury Abbey, whispering prayers for the souls lost, for the defeated heretic, and for the pilgrims who had survived. The fire, the shadow, the visions of death and torment, all had been part of a divine test, and now the record of their survival and triumph offered proof that faith, courage, and perseverance could overcome even the most sinister of threats. Archbishop William entered the chamber quietly, placing a hand on Elric's shoulder. "You have returned to us, Brother Elric, body and soul intact. The trials you faced were beyond imagining, yet God has preserved you. The darkness that sought to claim our souls has been destroyed." Elric rose slowly, tall and dignified despite the lingering weariness, and smiled faintly. "It was never by my strength alone, Your Grace. Faith carried me through fire, shadow, and despair. God protected us all, and He guided my hand when the choices seemed impossible." Pilgrims gathered around in the abbey courtyard, offering their gratitude, recounting the stories of courage and acknowledging the man whose steadfast faith had preserved them. Elric listened quietly, humbled by the recognition yet aware that the true victory had been spiritual. The shadow that had haunted him, the fire in Damascus, and the visions in Jerusalem had tested not just his endurance, but his soul. He knelt in silent prayer, feeling the warmth of the morning sun, the voices of the pilgrims, and the hum of life around him. "Lord," he whispered, "I have walked through darkness. I have seen fire, disease, and death. I have faced shadow and despair, and yet you have preserved me. May my life continue to serve you, and may my faith guide others as it has guided me." Weeks passed, and the story of the pilgrimage became known throughout Canterbury and beyond. The Archbishop remained grateful, and the pilgrims returned to their homes, carrying both tales of terror and testimony of divine protection. The abbey itself commemorated the 2 monks who had been murdered, honouring their sacrifice and remembering the victory over the heretic who had sought to spread darkness. Elric Atherton, 56 years old, tall, slightly chubby, and now both physically and spiritually weathered, resumed his duties in the abbey. Yet within him remained the memory of fire, shadow, and the unyielding test of faith. He had been tried beyond the ordinary trials of man, yet his soul had endured, and in the quiet of the abbey, as candles flickered against ancient stone, Elric understood the true meaning of his pilgrimage. It was more than a journey to Jerusalem. It had been a journey through fire, shadow, and the deepest trials of the spirit. Faith had triumphed over darkness, courage over despair, and the soul of Elric Atherton remained intact, preserved by devotion, prayer, and the guiding hand of God. For the first time in months, he allowed himself a deep breath, a small smile touching his lips. The journey was over. The pilgrims were safe. The Archbishop was whole, and evil, though relentless, had been vanquished by faith, courage, and the enduring light of God's mercy.